Before we get started, just a quick note. This show is built on opinion, perspective, and open conversation. We're going to be talking about current events, government decisions, and cultural issues that people feel strongly about. And not everyone is going to agree with what's said here tonight. That's the point. The goal isn't to tell you what to think, it's to challenge how you think, to ask better questions, and to look at things from more than one angle, even when it's uncomfortable. So if you're here for honest discussion, a little pushback, and maybe a few moments that make you stop and rethink what you thought you knew, you're in the right place.
You ever get the feeling that something's off? Not in a loud, breaking news kind of way, but in that quiet, nagging way you can't quite shake? Like the headlines don't match what you're seeing in real life. Like the stories don't line up with how things actually feel day to day. Because right now, we're in one of those moments. Nothing looks like it's completely falling apart, but nothing feels stable either. And that gap, that space between what we're told and what we're experiencing, that's where things start to get interesting. This week alone, you've got stories that make you stop and go, hold on, how does that make sense? Situations where similar actions are getting completely different outcomes depending on who's involved, where you start asking whether the rules are actually the same for everyone. At the same time, you've got people working, grinding, doing everything they're supposed to do, and still feeling like the ground under them isn't as solid as it used to be. Not crashing, just shifting, quietly, steadily. And maybe that's the bigger issue right now. It's not chaos, it's inconsistency. It's not one big event you can point to, it's a pattern you start to notice. A headline here, a decision there, a story that gets pushed hard, another one that barely gets mentioned. And over time, that builds into something bigger, doubt. Not just in the system, but in the information itself. Because if you can't trust that you're getting the full picture, how do you know what's real? So tonight, we're digging into that. Not just what's happening, but how it's being handled, how it's being presented, and why it feels like the same set of rules doesn't always apply across the board. We're talking about justice, about stability, about trust, and whether any of those things still mean what we think they mean. Because one thing's for sure, people are starting to notice. And once that happens, it's a whole different conversation. All right, let's bring in the crew, because if there's ever a night we're going to need different perspectives, a little pushback, and probably a few shots fired across the table, it's tonight. This isn't one of those easy, clean-cut conversations where everyone nods along and agrees. This is one of those topics where how you see things matters just as much as what actually happened. And I've got a feeling this one's going to get interesting real fast. First up, Brian is in the building, bringing that full MAGA Fire Friday energy like always. And Brian, I already know where you're leaning on this, because anytime we start talking about double standards, about uneven enforcement, about whether the system is actually playing it straight, you don't exactly ease into those takes, you come in swinging. So I'm expecting zero hesitation, probably a few raised eyebrows, and at least one moment where Rachel's already shaking her head before you even finish your first sentence. Rachel's here as well, keeping us grounded, or at least trying to, because somebody's got to be the one to slow things down and separate what feels true from what can actually be backed up. And Rachel, this is right in your lane, because there's nuance here whether people want to admit it or not. It's not always as simple as this side good, that side bad, and I know you're going to dig into that, probably challenge a few assumptions, and definitely make Brian work a little harder for those hot takes tonight. Daniel is back at the table too, our resident conspiracy board architect, connecting dots whether they want to be connected or not. And Daniel, this is basically your Super Bowl. Because when people start talking about patterns, inconsistencies, and things not quite adding up, you're already 10 steps ahead asking who benefits, what's happening behind the curtain, and why the story we're being told might not be the full one. So I'm expecting some theories tonight that are either going to make people think or make them very uncomfortable. And of course, Skylar is here, coming in from the progressive side, ready to challenge just about everything that gets said tonight. And Skylar, let's be honest, you're probably already looking at this whole two-tier system conversation and thinking it's being exaggerated, politicized, or flat out misrepresented. But that's exactly why you're here. Because if we're going to have this conversation, we're going to hear the pushback too, and not just stay in an echo chamber. And me, I'm going to be right in the middle of all of it, asking the questions, calling out what doesn't make sense, and making sure we're not just reacting, but actually thinking through what we're seeing. Because tonight isn't just about what happened, it's about whether the system behind it is as consistent as we've been told it is. All right, let's start right here, because this is one of those topics that people feel even if they can't always explain it perfectly. You see a headline, you hear about a case, a ruling, an investigation, and something just doesn't sit right. Not always because of what happened, but because of how it's handled. Because you start noticing a pattern, or at least what looks like a pattern, where similar situations don't seem to get the same treatment, where outcomes feel different depending on who's involved, what side they're on, or how much attention the story gets. And once people start seeing that, even if it's perception, even if it's incomplete information, it plants a seed. Because the one thing a system like ours depends on more than anything else is trust. And that's where this gets tricky. Because on one hand, you've got people saying, no, the system is working exactly the way it's supposed to. Every case is different, every situation has its own variables. And that's true. But on the other hand, you've got a growing number of people looking at these outcomes side by side and going, there's no way those differences are just coincidence. And whether that's reality or perception, the impact is the same. Confidence starts to erode. And once people start believing the rules aren't applied evenly, it doesn't just affect politics. It affects how people see fairness itself. So here's the question we're kicking this off with, and I want real answers, not just talking points. Are we actually seeing a two-tier system when it comes to justice and accountability? Or are people connecting dots that don't really belong together? And more importantly, does perception matter just as much as reality when it comes to trust in the system? Rachel, I'm going to start with you.
I think the reason this conversation keeps coming up is because people are reacting to patterns. But the danger is assuming that similar-looking situations are actually the same under the surface. Legal cases, investigations, and enforcement decisions are almost never identical, even when they look that way from a headline. Different jurisdictions, different evidence thresholds, different timelines, different prosecutorial discretion. All of that plays a role. And when you compress complex legal decisions into short news clips or social media posts, it's very easy for things to look inconsistent when, in reality, they're just complicated. That said, perception absolutely matters, and I think that's where institutions have a real problem right now. Even if everything is being handled properly behind the scenes, if the public doesn't believe that, then trust erodes anyway. And once trust starts slipping, people stop giving the benefit of the doubt. They start assuming bias first and facts second. That's a dangerous place to be because it creates a feedback loop. People expect unfairness, so they see it everywhere, which makes them trust the system even less. So I don't think it's as simple as saying there is a two-tier system. But I also don't think it's helpful to dismiss people's concerns outright. There's a transparency problem, a communication problem, and honestly, a credibility problem. And until those are addressed, even fair outcomes are going to be questioned. The system doesn't just have to be fair, it has to look fair, consistently, or people are going to keep asking these exact questions.
And that right there is where it gets complicated. Because what you're saying makes sense on paper. Every case is different, every situation has its own variables, and when you actually dig into the details, things aren't always as black and white as they seem at first glance. But I think where people start pushing back is when those explanations keep coming up over and over again, and yet the outcomes still feel off. Because at some point, people stop asking what are the differences and start asking, why do the differences always seem to go one direction? And that's where perception starts turning into belief. Not just, this looks uneven, but this is uneven. And whether that's accurate or not, once people land there, it's hard to pull them back. Because now it's not just about one case, it's about trust in the entire system. So, Brian, let me bring you in here because I already know you're not buying the "it's just complicated" explanation. When you look at this, do you see nuance like Rachel's talking about? Or do you see a system that's flat out applying the rules differently depending on who's involved?
No, I'm not buying that it's just complicated. And I think that's exactly the kind of explanation people are getting tired of hearing. Because yeah, every case has its own details. Every situation has its own variables. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it stops looking like random complexity and starts looking like a pattern. And not a subtle one either. You've got situations where one group gets the full weight of the system dropped on them. Fast, aggressive, no hesitation. And then other situations where things drag out, get downplayed, or just quietly disappear. At some point, people aren't crazy for noticing that. And here's the thing that really gets me. It's not just about outcomes. It's about energy. It's about how quickly things move, how aggressively they're pursued, how much attention they get from institutions in the media at the same time. Because you can feel the difference. Some stories get treated like five-alarm fires, non-stop coverage, constant updates. This is the biggest threat imaginable. And then other things that look just as serious barely get a mention, or they're brushed off like they're not a big deal. That's not just legal nuance, that's selective priority. And when people see that over and over again, you're not going to convince them it's all just coincidence or complexity. They start to believe the system isn't blind, it's picking sides. And once that belief sets in, it's game over for trust. Because now people aren't asking, what are the facts? They're asking, who's this going to benefit? And that's a dangerous place for any system to be, because once people stop believing in equal rules, they stop respecting the system altogether.
And that's the part right there that hits hard. The pattern argument. Not one case, not one decision, but the accumulation of them over time, where people start connecting those dots whether they're supposed to or not. And Brian, what you're saying is what a lot of people are feeling. It's not just what happens, it's how it happens, how fast, how loud, how aggressively it's pushed. That's where people start raising eyebrows. But here's where it can go a completely different direction. Because once you start talking about patterns, about consistency, about outcomes lining up a certain way, that's where some people say, hold on, this isn't random at all. So Daniel, I'm coming to you, because this is exactly where you usually take things a step further. Are we just seeing human bias and inconsistency play out in a messy system? Or is there something more coordinated behind how these situations are handled and presented?
I don't think you can look at this purely as random inconsistency anymore. I think that's the comfortable explanation, the one that lets people believe the system is just messy, but ultimately neutral. But when you start seeing the same types of outcomes, the same kinds of narratives, the same directional pressure over and over again, it stops looking like chaos and starts looking like alignment. And alignment doesn't happen by accident at scale. It happens because the incentives are lined up that way. Think about it. Institutions, media, political actors, all operating in the same environment, all responding to the same pressures. Reputation, power, influence, public perception. Those things drive decisions whether people admit it or not. So when a situation comes up, it's not just about the facts of the case, it's about how that case fits into a larger narrative, what it reinforces, what it threatens, and who stands to gain or lose depending on how it's handled. That's where things start to shift from justice to management. And I'm not saying there's some smoke-filled room where everyone's coordinating every move. That's not how this works. It's more subtle than that. It's about systems that reward certain behaviors and punish others, about people making decisions that align with those incentives, often without even realizing it. Over time, that creates consistency, not because it's centrally controlled, but because everyone's playing the same game. And the result is what people are picking up on. Outcomes that seem to follow a pattern, even if no one's openly admitting there's a pattern at all. So when people ask, is this a two-tier system? I think they're asking the right question, but maybe not in the right way. It's not just two tiers, it's a system that naturally tilts based on incentives, narratives, and pressure. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee it.
And that's where this goes from frustration to something deeper. Because Daniel's not even talking about individual decisions anymore. He's talking about the environment those decisions are made in. Incentives, pressure, narratives, and whether those things quietly shape outcomes in ways people don't fully see. But this is exactly where the pushback comes in, because not everyone agrees that what we're seeing is some kind of systemic tilt. Some people hear that and think it's overreach or reading too much into situations that already have explanations. So, Skylar, let me bring you in here because you're probably looking at this whole conversation from a completely different angle. When you hear Brian talk about patterns and Daniel talk about systemic tilt, do you think they're identifying something real, or are they building a narrative out of selective examples?
I think what you're hearing from Brian and Daniel is frustration, but I don't think the conclusions they're drawing actually hold up when you look at the full picture. Because the reality is, people tend to notice patterns that confirm what they already believe, and ignore the ones that don't. That's not a knock on anyone, that's just human nature. But when it comes to something as complex as the legal system, selective examples can be really misleading. You can take two cases that look similar on the surface and build a whole narrative around them. But once you actually dig into the details, they often aren't comparable in the way people assume they are. And I think that's where this idea of a two-tier system starts to fall apart. Because if that were truly the case, if there was this consistent, coordinated effort to apply the law differently based on politics or identity, you would expect to see uniform outcomes across the board. But you don't. You see plenty of cases where outcomes cut in different directions, where decisions don't neatly fit into one narrative or the other. That inconsistency doesn't necessarily prove bias. It often just proves that the system is complicated, decentralized, and sometimes flawed in ways that don't follow a single pattern. Now, that doesn't mean everything is perfect. It's not. There are absolutely issues with transparency, with communication, and sometimes with accountability. But jumping from "this feels inconsistent" to "this is intentionally unequal" is a big leap. And I think that leap is being made a little too quickly. Because once you frame it that way, everything starts to get filtered through that lens, and it becomes harder to have an honest conversation about what's actually happening versus what people believe is happening. So to me, this isn't about denying that people feel something is off. It's about being careful not to turn that feeling into a conclusion without enough evidence to back it up.
And that right there is the split. That's the line we keep running into. On one side, you've got people saying, look at the outcomes, look at the patterns, something isn't lining up. And on the other side, you've got the argument that what looks like a pattern might just be selective focus, incomplete information, or a system that's more complicated than people want it to be. And both of those things can exist at the same time. That's what makes this so hard to pin down. Because here's the reality. Most people aren't reading full case files. They're not digging through legal documents. They're seeing headlines, clips, summaries. And from that, they're forming opinions about whether the system is fair or not. And once those opinions start to solidify, it doesn't take much to reinforce them. Every new story becomes another piece of evidence, whether it actually fits or not. And that's how perception starts to shape reality in a very real way. But at the same time, you can't just brush it off either. Because when enough people start asking the same question, when enough people feel like something isn't consistent, you have to at least look at why that perception exists. Even if the system is technically functioning the way it's supposed to, if the public doesn't believe that, then there's a disconnect that needs to be addressed. Trust isn't automatic, it's earned, and it's maintained. So whether this is a true two-tier system, a misinterpretation of complex cases, or something in between, one thing is clear. People are paying attention and they're asking harder questions than they used to. And once that starts happening, it changes the entire conversation. All right, let's shift gears, but not too far, because this ties right into what people are actually feeling day to day. And this is one of those topics that doesn't always dominate headlines, but it's everywhere if you're paying attention. You talk to people, you see it in your own circles, you hear it in passing conversations. Someone got laid off, someone's company is restructuring, someone's hours got cut, or hiring just quietly froze. It's not loud, it's not one big collapse, but it's steady, it's subtle. And that's what makes it harder to define, but easier to feel. Because on paper, you'll hear things like, the economy is strong, unemployment is stable. All the big picture indicators that are supposed to reassure people. But then you look at what's actually happening at ground level, and it tells a slightly different story. Companies tightening up, people feeling less secure, fewer opportunities than there were even a year ago. It's not panic, it's uncertainty. And sometimes that's worse, because you don't know if you're about to be fine or next. And what makes this even more frustrating is the disconnect between those two realities. Because when people are hearing everything's fine while they're watching friends lose jobs or struggling to find work, it creates that same kind of doubt we were just talking about. Not just about the economy, but about the messaging around it. Because if things are truly strong, why does it feel like people are bracing for impact instead of moving forward with confidence? So here's the question, and this one hits a little closer to home for a lot of people. Are we actually in a stable economy that just feels worse than it is? Or are we in the middle of a slow, quiet downturn that hasn't fully shown itself yet? And why does there seem to be such a gap between what we're told and what people are experiencing? Brian, I'm going to start with you.
No, I don't think this is just feels worse than it is. I think people are picking up on something real, and it's just not being talked about the way it should be. Because you don't need a headline telling you the economy is shaky when you're seeing people around you getting cut, hiring slowing down, and companies tightening everything up at the same time. That's not random, that's a shift. And the problem is it's happening quietly enough that it doesn't trigger panic, but consistently enough that people start bracing for it anyway.
Yeah, and that's the part that stands out. It's not one big moment, it's a pattern you feel building. Not loud enough to make national panic, but enough to make people uneasy. Daniel, let me bring you in. Is this just economic cycles doing what they always do? Or is there something deeper behind why this feels so drawn out and quiet?
I think what makes this feel different is how controlled it looks from the outside. Normally, downturns hit hard and fast. You know exactly what's happening. But this feels managed, like pressure being released slowly instead of all at once. Companies aren't collapsing, they're trimming. Hiring isn't gone, it's just cautious. That creates this strange middle ground where technically things are fine. But behavior tells you people are preparing for something.
That slow release idea, that's exactly what people are feeling. Not crisis, but not confidence either. Rachel, let me bring you in. Are we overreading normal economic shifts? Or is this actually something people should be paying closer attention to?
I think it's a mix of both. There are normal cycles in any economy, periods where companies pull back, reassess, and adjust after growth. But what's different right now is how visible those adjustments have become. With layoffs being shared instantly and widely, it amplifies the sense that something bigger is happening. That doesn't mean there's a hidden collapse, but it does mean people are more aware of instability, even if the overall system is still functioning.
That awareness piece is big, because once people start noticing it, it changes how they move, how they spend, how they plan. Skylar, let's close this out. Is this more about perception and visibility, or do you think there's a real reason people feel less secure right now?
I think people feel less secure because things are shifting, but that doesn't automatically mean we're heading into something worse. Industries evolve, companies adjust, and sometimes that creates temporary instability. The issue is that uncertainty spreads faster than stability, so people react to what they see around them before the data fully catches up. That doesn't mean their concerns aren't valid. It just means the bigger picture may not be as negative as it feels in the moment.
And that right there is the tension, because you've got two realities happening at the same time. On paper, things can still look stable, still look functional, still look like the system is holding together. But on the ground, people are feeling something shift. Less confidence, more caution, more uncertainty about what comes next. And whether that's perception, visibility, or the early signs of something bigger, it changes how people move. Because once people start pulling back, spending less, hesitating more, bracing instead of building, that feeling becomes real in its own way. And that's what makes this different. It's not about one big collapse. It's about a slow change in behavior that builds over time. And whether this levels out or turns into something more, one thing's clear. People are paying attention, and they're adjusting. All right, let's pick up the pace a little, because this is where things get fast, a little sharper, and yeah, probably a little more fun. We've talked about systems, we've talked about the economy, but now we're getting into the part where people are just flat out rolling their eyes at what they're being told. Headlines, narratives, viral moments, things that a few years ago people might have just accepted, and now they're questioning instantly. Because that's the shift. It's not just disagreement anymore, it's skepticism. People aren't just saying, I don't like that. They're saying, I don't believe that. And once you hit that point, everything changes. Media, messaging, institutions, it all gets filtered through that lens of, what's really going on here? So we're going to run through a few of these. Quick hits, gut reactions, no overthinking it. First one. When a major story breaks now, whether it's political, cultural, or economic, do you trust that you're getting the full picture? Or do you automatically assume there's more being left out? Brian, quick hit.
At this point, I assume we're getting maybe half the story, if that. Not because everything is fake, but because everything is filtered. There's always an angle, always something emphasized and something ignored. And people have figured that out. That's why trust is dropping, because it doesn't feel like information anymore. It feels like messaging.
Yeah, and once people start feeling like they're being guided instead of informed, it's hard to unsee that. Next one. If the media came out tomorrow and said, we got this wrong, do you think people would accept it? Or is trust already too far gone? Rachel, go.
I think some people would accept it, but a lot wouldn't, and that's the problem. Once trust drops below a certain point, even honesty gets questioned. Rebuilding that takes consistency over time, not just one correction.
Yeah, trust isn't rebuilt in a moment. It's rebuilt over time. And right now, we're not seeing a lot of that. Next one. Do you think narratives are shaped more by facts or by what keeps people engaged and reacting? Daniel.
Engagement, no question. Attention is currency now, and the more emotional the story, the more it spreads. Facts still matter, but they're often framed in whatever way drives the strongest reaction.
And that's where things start getting blurry. Because now it's not just what happened, it's how was it presented. Last one. Are we heading toward a point where people completely tune out mainstream narratives? Or are we already there? Skylar, close it out.
I don't think we're fully there, but we're close. People aren't tuning out information. They're just choosing different sources. The risk is that instead of one shared reality, we end up with multiple versions of it, and that makes real understanding a lot harder.
And that might be the biggest shift of all. Not that people stop paying attention, but that they stopped agreeing on what they're seeing. Because once that happens, it's not just debate anymore. It's different realities colliding at the same time. And whether that leads to better awareness or deeper division, that's still playing out.
All right, before we keep this rolling, let's take a second and talk about something that actually keeps this show going. And that's you guys. And the merch you've been showing love to. If you've been rocking with Data and Dissonance, you already know this isn't just a podcast. It's a mindset. It's about asking questions, pushing back, and not just accepting whatever gets thrown in front of you. And we've built merch around that exact energy. From hoodies and tees to hats, mugs, and those bumper stickers that tend to get a little attention at stoplights. You're not just wearing something, you're saying something. And let's talk about the coffee for a second, because this has been blowing up. You've got the High Lakes Light Roast, smooth, a little citrus, easy to drink. The Rock Creek Medium Roast, balanced, a little richer, kind of your everyday go-to. And then the Bitterroot Dark French Roast, bold, strong, no nonsense. Kind of like this show. Whether you're starting your morning or gearing up for a long day, we've got something that fits your pace. So if you want to support the show, represent what we're building here, and grab something you'll actually use, check out the merch store. All the links are right there in the description. Every single order helps keep this thing growing, keeps the conversations going, and honestly, it means more than you probably realize. Now let's get back into it.
You know, if there's one thing that ties everything we talked about tonight together, it's this feeling that people are starting to trust themselves more than the systems around them. Whether it's how justice is applied, how the economy is actually functioning, or how stories are being told. There's a growing gap between what people are hearing and what they're experiencing. And that gap, that disconnect, is where frustration starts to build. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly, over time, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Because the truth is, most people aren't looking for perfection. They're not expecting everything to be flawless or every decision to be identical. What they're looking for is consistency. They're looking for fairness. They're looking for something that feels stable and makes sense when they step back and look at the bigger picture. And right now, for a lot of people, it just doesn't feel that way. It feels uneven. It feels uncertain. And whether that's perception, reality, or somewhere in between, it's real enough to change how people think, how they act, and how they move forward. But here's the part that matters, because this isn't just about frustration. It's about awareness. People are paying attention in a way they didn't used to. They're asking harder questions. They're comparing what they see, and they're not as quick to accept simple answers anymore. And that can be a good thing if it leads to better conversations, better accountability, and a better understanding of what's actually happening around us. Because the moment people stop asking questions, that's when things really start to slip. So whether you agree with everything we said tonight or not, the point isn't agreement, it's engagement. It's thinking a little deeper, questioning a little more, and not just taking things at face value. Because the world we're living in right now, it's layered, it's complicated, and it's changing. And the only way to keep up with that is to stay aware. And as always, remember to speak truth and stir thought.
Tonight's episode is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, including The Covenant Protocol, The Prophet Directive, and Black Echo Rising. If you like stories that move fast, hit hard, and feel just a little too real at times, this series is built for you. It's action, suspense, and a look at the kind of world where power, control, and truth don't always line up the way they should. And if you've been listening to the show, you already know this isn't just entertainment. It's an extension of everything we talk about here. The same themes, the same tension, the same questions, just told through a different lens. And don't forget the music. If you haven't checked it out yet, make sure you listen to Uncaged, that raw, gritty alt-rock sound, and Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, bringing that country energy with a little edge. Two completely different vibes, same mindset behind both. All the links are in the description. Books, music, merch, everything you need to tap into what we're building here.